The Mark Hopkins Hotel sits at the top of Nob Hill, 1 block from the Fairmont, San Francisco, on a site that the railroad baron Mark Hopkins purchased in the 1870s, and on which his widow built a Victorian mansion so extravagant that it became a San Francisco landmark before it burned in the 1906 earthquake. The hotel that replaced it opened in 1926, and has been described in every decade since as occupying the finest hotel view position in the continental United States. The top of the Mark, its 19th floor cocktail lounge, has been a documented fixture of San Francisco cultural life since it opened in 1939. During World War II, it served as the last American bar that departing Pacific Theater servicemen visited before shipping out, a fact documented in enough personal accounts to constitute a category of American cultural memory specific to this address. None of that paid the note. The Mark Hopkins entered financial distress in the early 1990s under circumstances that paralleled the Fairmont's Loma Prieta crisis with enough precision to constitute a forensic pattern specific to Nob Hill hospitality assets in seismically active markets. The ownership structure that had acquired the Mark Hopkins in the mid-1980s, at the peak of the San Francisco luxury hotel acquisition cycle, had placed a debt load on the asset that the hotel's operating cash flows could not service when the combination of the 1989 earthquake's impact on San Francisco tourism, the subsequent recession, and the specific capital expenditure obligations imposed by California's post-Loma Prieta seismic retrofit requirements simultaneously compressed revenue and expanded costs. The view from the 19th floor did not change. The debt service calendar did not adjust. The covenant thresholds written into the credit facility at acquisition were written for a market that the earthquake and the recession had temporarily made unreachable, and temporarily was long enough to trigger the default mechanisms that the loan documents specified. The forensic entry point for this case is the relationship between iconic positioning and financial viability, because the Mark Hopkins documents with precision the proposition that this channel has examined across 9 previous case files, that the most valuable real estate positions in American hospitality are also the most reliably over-leveraged ones, because the cultural authority of the address consistently allows ownership to borrow more than the operations can service. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. The credit facility that financed the Mark Hopkins acquisition in the mid-1980s was structured during a period of San Francisco luxury hospitality market optimism, so complete that the lenders and the ownership had treated the worst-case scenario as a temporary disruption rather than as a structural condition of owning a pre-war hotel in an active seismic zone in a city whose convention and tourism economy was cyclically volatile. The debt service coverage ratio covenant had been written at a threshold that required the hotel to maintain revenue per available room at a level consistent with peak market performance. It had not been written to accommodate the simultaneous occurrence of a major seismic event, a national recession, and a multi-year seismic retrofit program. The covenant that nobody read carefully enough was the one that specified what would happen to the debt service requirement if all 3 of those conditions arrived at the same time. The answer, as the early 1990s demonstrated, was that the covenant would be breached, the lender would have the right to declare the loan in default, and the ownership would face a forced restructuring or sale at a moment when the San Francisco luxury hotel market had no appetite for acquiring a distressed asset at a price that would have allowed the existing ownership to retire its debt at par. The Mark Hopkins ownership attempted to negotiate a restructuring with its lender group through 1991 and 1992. The negotiation failed to produce terms acceptable to both parties. The hotel was ultimately transferred to new ownership through a process that reflected the financial distress of the existing ownership rather than the commercial potential of the asset. The new ownership acquired the Mark Hopkins at a basis that reflected the distressed market conditions of the early 1990s, rather than the asset's stabilized value under normal operating conditions, a pattern documented in the Fontainebleau, Greenbrier, and Fairmont case files that this channel has identified as the standard resolution mechanism for over-leveraged trophy hospitality assets. The specific irony of the Mark Hopkins situation is that the view that had justified the acquisition premium did not depreciate during the distress period. The bay was still there. The Golden Gate was still there. The city below was still there. What had changed was the ownership's capacity to service the debt that the view had allowed it to incur. What point does an iconic position become a financial trap rather than a financial asset? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal that justified the Mark Hopkins acquisition in the mid-1980s was constructed on three inputs that the subsequent decade invalidated simultaneously. The first input was a stabilized revenue per available room projection calibrated to the peak of the mid-1980s San Francisco luxury hotel market, a market that had been inflated by the technology sector's early expansion, the Pacific Rim investment activity of the period, and a convention calendar that the Moscone Center's opening in 1981 had expanded significantly. The second input was a capitalization rate reflecting the compressed yield environment of the mid-1980s institutional real estate market, a rate that treated the trophy asset premium, a Nob Hill address, as permanent rather than cyclical. The third input was a capital expenditure projection that treated the seismic retrofit obligations of a 1926 structure in an active fault zone as a bounded one-time cost, rather than as a recurring structural feature of ownership. All three inputs moved against the ownership simultaneously between 1989 and 1993. The revenue per available room compressed as the earthquake disrupted tourism and the recession reduced business travel. The capitalization rate expanded as institutional investors demanded higher yields for real estate assets across all categories in the post-savings and loan crisis credit environment. And the capital expenditure projection proved inadequate when the California Building Code's post-Loma Prieta retrofit requirements imposed costs that the acquisition appraisal had not modeled with accuracy. The appraisal failure at the Mark Hopkins is forensically interesting not because it was unusual, but because it was representative. The same three-input failure, revenue compression, capitalization rate expansion, and seismic retrofit cost underestimation, produced the Fairmont's distress in the same period under nearly identical market conditions. The two hotels occupy the same hill, serve the same market, face the same seismic environment, and were acquired in the same market cycle by ownership structures with similar debt profiles. That both entered financial distress in the same three-year window is not coincidence. It is the natural experiment that confirms the forensic pattern this channel has identified across its full case file archive. Appraisal methodologies that treat peak cycle inputs as stable baselines produce capital structures with no tolerance for the cyclical corrections that every market eventually delivers. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The ownership structure that acquired the Mark Hopkins in the mid-1980s shared a characteristic with every over-leveraged hospitality ownership this channel has documented: the belief that the specific circumstances that had made the acquisition financially viable at the moment of purchase would persist long enough for the ownership to refinance, sell, or operationally grow its way out of the debt structure before the market delivered the correction that the debt structure had no capacity to absorb. That belief was not irrational at the moment of acquisition. The San Francisco luxury hotel market in 1985 and 1986 was performing at a level that made the acquisition price and the associated debt structure appear conservative relative to the market's trajectory. The technology sector was expanding. Pacific Rim capital was flowing into the Bay Area economy. The convention calendar was growing. The view from the 19th floor was unchanged and unchallengeable as the finest hotel view position in the continental United States. Nothing about the market at the moment of acquisition suggested that three simultaneous adverse developments would arrive within 3 years and persist long enough to exhaust the ownership's financial capacity to service its obligations. The denial embedded in the ownership structure was not the denial of information available at the time of acquisition. It was the denial of the possibility that the worst-case scenario could arrive before the ownership had accumulated enough financial cushion to survive it. That denial is the common element across every failed ownership structure this channel has documented, from case file 001 through case file 010. The Fontainebleau developers denied that the credit market would contract before the hotel opened. The plaza's successive owners denied that the building's operating cash flows were structurally insufficient to service acquisition-level debt. The Waldorf's Anbang denied that the Chinese regulatory environment would intervene before the renovation was complete. The Mark Hopkins ownership denied that the earthquake, the recession, and the retrofit requirements would arrive simultaneously. They all arrived simultaneously. The denial did not alter the sequence. It only determined how long the ownership remained in the asset after the sequence began and before the forced resolution that the covenant structure required. The Mark Hopkins Hotel was acquired out of distress by Intercontinental Hotels Group, which has operated the property under the Intercontinental flag since 1994. A tenure of more than 30 years that has produced a capital investment record significantly more consistent than the mid-1980s ownership managed during its shorter and more financially turbulent period of control. The Intercontinental ownership has renovated the guest rooms, maintained the top of the mark as a functioning cultural institution, and managed the property's competitive position in the San Francisco luxury hotel market through the multiple demand cycles that have characterized that market since the mid-1990s, including the dot-com boom and bust, the post-September 11 travel disruption, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The top of the mark has operated continuously through all of those cycles. The view has not changed. The bay is still there. The Golden Gate is still there. The servicemen who visited in 1943 are not, but the accounts they left of that last American bar before the Pacific have made the lounge one of the most historically documented cocktail destinations in American hospitality, a cultural asset that the Intercontinental ownership has maintained without attempting to monetize in ways that would compromise its historical character. What the Mark Hopkins case reveals in the context of this channel's full archive is the completion of the Nob Hill forensic pattern that the Fairmont case file initiated. Two hotels on the same hill, acquired in the same market cycle, by ownership structures with similar debt profiles, produced identical distress outcomes in the same 3-year window. Both were subsequently acquired by institutional hospitality operators whose optimization targets were aligned with the building's long-term commercial health rather than with the financial engineering that the mid-1980s acquisition environment had made temporarily attractive. Both have operated without further bankruptcy proceedings under their post-distress ownership structures. The pattern that destroyed the mid-1980s ownership structures on Nob Hill is the same pattern documented in every case file in this channel's archive. The capital structure was optimized for a scenario that the market did not sustain. The buildings were not the problem. They never are. The buildings outlasted the debt structures, the ownership groups, the appraisals, and the market cycles that produced them. They will outlast the next ones too. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between iconic positioning and financial viability in luxury hospitality assets, subscribe to this channel because the next case examines a building that the market valued correctly and the ownership destroyed anyway, a rarer and more instructive category of failure. And in the comments, given the near-identical distress outcomes of the Mark Hopkins and the Fairmont in the same 3-year window, what does the Nob Hill pattern reveal about the systemic underpricing of seismic and cyclical risk in San Francisco trophy asset underwriting? The case file is open.